Lure, a young mage, paced around the summoning circle he had just drawn on the floor. He was trying to do a simple protection spell. This is simple, Lure muttered to himself. Even kids can do this. He inhaled sharply, held his hands out, and began chanting. The air grew heavy. Then there was a blinding flash of red light. When the light faded, Lure blinked several times to clear his vision. He froze. Standing in the middle of the circle was not a ball of protective energy, but a man, a very tall, very intimidating man with horns, glowing eyes, and a lazy smirk. "Well, this is unexpected," the man said, his deep voice laced with amusement. Lure took several steps back, his mind racing. "You're not supposed to be here," he stammered. The man's smirk widened. Clearly, he looked around the small workshop and raised an eyebrow. "Cozy, though I've seen dungeons with better decor." "Who are you?" Lure demanded, though his voice shook. The man placed a hand on his chest, acting offended. "You don't know? I'm Kale, King of the Abyss, ruler of demons." He paused, tilting his head. "You're a terrible summoner if you don't even know what you've called forth." "I wasn't summoning you," Lure said. "I was casting a protection spell." Kale laughed, the sound low and rich. "Well, congratulations. You've summoned the greatest protection you'll ever need." Lure groaned, rubbing his temples. "This is bad. This is so bad." Kale stepped out of the circle, his movements predatory. Lure stumbled back further until his back hit the wall. "You're not going to destroy me, are you?" Lure asked, his voice trembling. Kale leaned in, his face inches from Lure's. "Destroy you? Where's the fun in that? I'm bored of ruling the Abyss. I think I'll stay here for a while." "You can't stay here," Lure blurted, panicked. Kale chuckled, his sharp teeth making its presence known. "Oh, but I can, and I will. After all." His voice dropped, teasing. "You did summon me, little mage. I think you owe me some hospitality." Lure's breath hitched as Kale's eyes bore into his. The tension in the air, so thick it was almost suffocating. Lure couldn't sleep that night. Every faint noise had him clutching his blanket tighter. He knew that somewhere in the dark house, Kale was lurking. "I've got to send him back," Lure whispered to himself, staring at the ceiling. "Tomorrow. First thing, before anyone finds out." Just as he was convincing himself that Kale wouldn't murder him in his sleep, his bedroom door creaked open. Lure shot up, heart hammering. What are you doing?" Kale leaned casually against the doorframe, his horns casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. He wasn't wearing a cloak anymore, leaving his broad shoulders on full display. "Relax, little mage. I got hungry," Kale said, holding up a half-eaten apple. "You didn't exactly do a welcome feast." "Help yourself, why don't you?" Lure muttered, sinking back into bed. "But don't come in here." Kale tilted his head, his red eyes glinting mischievously. "Why? Afraid I'll bite?" Lure's face turned red. "I what? No." Kale stepped into the room anyway, stopping at the edge of the bed, looking down at him with an amused expression. "You summoned the king of demons, yet you can't even look me in the eye without turning red." "I'm not," Lure started, but when Kale crouched down to his level, he lost all sense of coherent thought. Kale smirked. "Exactly." Lure swallowed hard, gripping the edge of his blanket like it was a lifeline. "Can you please go haunt someone else?" Kale chuckled, standing up and heading toward the door. "Good night, little mage. Sweet dreams." Lure watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest. Sending him back tomorrow, he whispered to himself again. The next morning, Lure paced his workshop, clutching the grimoire tightly in his hands. The summoning circle was redrawn, and he had triple-checked the reversal spell. This had to work. Kale lounged in a chair nearby, chewing lazily on a piece of bread, watching Lure with faint amusement. "You're very determined for someone who barely knows what they're doing." Lure ignored him, muttering the incantation under his breath. The chalk lines on the floor began to glow faintly. "All right," Lure said, taking a deep breath. "This is it. Time to send you back." Kale raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "By all means try." Lure began chanting louder, his voice echoing through the room. The glowing circle pulsed with energy, and for a moment he thought it might actually work. But then the light fizzled out completely. "Wait, what?" Lure stammered. "That should have worked." Kale snorted, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, little mage, you really thought it would be that easy?" Lure turned to him, frustrated. "What do you mean? You're a summoned entity. I should be able to send you back the same way you came." Kale smirked. "True, but here's the thing. I can't be sent back unless I want to go back." Lure stared at him in shock. "That's ridiculous. The only reason you managed to summon me in the first place was because I wanted to leave." Kale said. Lure blinked. "You wanted to leave? Why?" Kale's smirk faltered for a moment. Let's just say ruling the abyss gets boring. So you abandoned your responsibilities? Lure asked, incredulous. Kale just shrugged. Lure pinched the bridge of his nose, groaning. This is a disaster. I can't have you here forever. People will notice. And what am I supposed to do if the council finds out I summoned the Demon King? Kale's eyes gleamed. Then I suggest you persuade me to go back. Lure groaned again. This is going to be impossible. Kale chuckled, crossing his arms. A little mage, I like it here. It's quiet. And you're entertaining. I am not here to entertain you. Lure snapped. Sure you're not, Kale said, smirking. But you do it so well. Lure buried his face in his hands, wondering how he'd ended up in this mess. All right, Lure started, clearing his throat and summoning his courage. How do I, persuade you to go back? Kale stood, his towering figure making the room feel much smaller. He closed the distance between them with slow steps, his voice dropping to a low, teasing murmur. You could try asking nicely, though I doubt you have the charm for that. Lure swallowed hard, his back pressing against the desk behind him. What's that supposed to mean? Kale tilted his head, a wicked grin playing on his lips. Or perhaps you could tempt me. Offer something that makes staying here less appealing, though I doubt it would make me want to go. Lure's breath hitched as Kale leaned in, his face far too close for comfort. You're insane, Lure muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm just giving you options. Though I have to admit, his gaze lingered on Lure's flustered expression. The idea of you trying to seduce me is entertaining. Lure's face went scarlet. I am not seducing you. Kale chuckled, pulling back just enough to give Lure space to breathe. Shame. Lure glared at him, though the effect was ruined by the blush creeping up his neck. This isn't funny. I'm trying to solve a problem, and you're mocking me. Kale shrugged, his grin never fading. Maybe, but can you blame me? You're very amusing when you're flustered. Lure groaned, dragging a hand down his face. This is hopeless. Kale chuckled softly, his voice rich with amusement. Lure took a deep breath. If the Demon King wasn't going anywhere, he had to set some boundaries before he completely lost control of the situation. Fine, Lure said, crossing his arms and standing as tall as he could, even though Kale still loomed over him effortlessly. If you're going to stay here, there are rules. Kale raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Rules? Oh, this should be good. Let's hear them, little mage. Lure ignored the nickname. First rule, you do not use your powers. No summoning fire, no teleporting, no. Whatever else it is you demons do. Kale leaned back against the desk, looking unconcerned. All right, but if someone attacks you, I'm not just standing there like some helpless mortal. Fair, Lure says, his heart warming at the thought of the Demon Kings want to protect him. Second rule, you keep a low profile. No horns, no glowing eyes, and definitely no wandering around the village acting all demony. Demony? Kale repeated, his smirk widening. You really have a way with words. Focus. Lure snapped, glaring at him. Third rule, no touching me without my consent. Kale's grin turned wicked, and he leaned closer. Oh, are you afraid of what might happen if I did? Lure stepped back, his face flaming. It's called personal space, you demon. Kale chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. Fine little mage. I'll keep my hands to myself. For now. Lure groaned, feeling a headache forming. Fourth rule, you're not allowed in my bedroom. Ever. Kale pretended to look offended. What if you call for me in the middle of the night? What if you have a nightmare and need comfort? Nightmares about you are exactly what I'm trying to avoid. Lure shot back. Kale laughed. You're really too much fun. Fifth rule, no more of this. This flirting nonsense. I mean it. Kale's eyes gleamed with mischief. You think I'm flirting? I know you're flirting. Lure snapped, his blush deepening. Kale chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. Fine, no flirting. But I make no promises if you keep blushing like that. It's practically an invitation. Those are the rules. If you break them, I'll. He paused, realizing there's nothing he could really say to scare him. You'll what? Kale asked, his grin teasing. I'll make your life miserable, Lure declared, even though he knew it wasn't possible. Kale smirked, leaning closer once more. A little mage. You're already making my life very interesting. Lure groaned, burying his face in his hands. That afternoon, Lure rummaged through the pantry, sighing as he noted the lack of supplies. A half-empty jar of honey, a handful of dried herbs, and a single loaf of bread stared back at him. This won't do, he muttered, grabbing his coin pouch from the counter. Kale, lounging in a chair with his legs casually propped on the table, watched him with interest. And where are you going? Out, Lure said curtly. Kale raised an eyebrow. Out where? To get groceries. Kale's eyes lit up, and he dropped his feet to the floor, suddenly intrigued. Groceries? You mean mingling with mortals? Buying mundane things like potatoes? Lure blinked. Yes? Why you sound so excited about that? Kale stood, towering over him, with an almost childlike grin. I'm coming with you. Lure immediately shook his head in protest. Absolutely not. You'll stand out. Kale smirked, leaning down slightly to meet Lure's gaze. I can blend in. I want to see what your little mortal world has to offer. Lure groaned, already regretting this conversation. Kale, no. It's too risky. Someone will realize what you are. Kale crossed his arms. I'll disguise myself. With what? Your charming personality. Lure shot back, frustrated. A little mage, you underestimate me. He closed his eyes, and a faint shimmer of magic surrounded him. When he opened them again, his horns were gone, his crimson eyes replaced with a soft hazel, and his features slightly softened to appear more human. Luda stared, stunned. How? Centuries of practice, Kale said. Now let's go. Lure hesitated, still unsure. You have to promise to behave. No magic, no scaring people, and absolutely no flirting with anyone. Kale smirked, his expression far too smug. Not even with you? Lure glared at him. Especially not with me. Kale chuckled, gesturing toward the door. Lead the way, little mage. As they stepped out into the village, Lure kept his hood up, nervously glancing at Kale every few seconds. The Demon King strolled beside him confidently. Stop smiling at everyone, Lure hissed under his breath. Kale smirked. I'm being friendly. Isn't that what mortals do? Not like that, Lun muttered, pulling him toward a vegetable stand. The vendor, a kind old woman, greeted Lure with a warm smile. Ah, Lure, it's been a while. Who's your friend? Lure froze, fumbling for an explanation. Oh, he's, Kale cut in smoothly, flashing a charming smile. I'm Kale, Lure's assistant. Lun shot him a glare, but didn't correct him. The woman chuckled. Well, you've got yourself a handsome helper, Lure. Good for you. Lure's face burned as he busied himself inspecting the carrots. We're not, he's just, can I get 5 of these, please? Kale leaned closer to the vendor, his smile growing. What do you recommend for someone new to cooking? I'd love to help Lure out more. Lure nearly dropped the carrots, and Kale's eye twinkled in amusement. The vendor handed Kale a bundle of herbs. This'll add flavor to any dish. And don't be afraid to experiment, dear. Cooking's all about trying new things. Kale nodded. Thank you, kind lady. We're leaving now. Lure grabbed Kale's hands, about to pull him out of the ladies' stand. But as they turned to leave, a group of young villagers approached, laughing and teasing each other. One of them called out, Hey, Lure, didn't know you had a boyfriend. Lure almost tripped over his own feet. He's not he tried to explain, but was cut off as Kale slung an arm over his shoulders. It's nice to meet Lure's friends, Kale said smoothly, smiling brightly. The group hooted and hollered, clearly misunderstanding. Lure's face turned crimson as he shoved Kale's arm off. Can you stop? Kale grinned down at him, clearly enjoying the reaction. I'm just trying to blend in. Lure groaned, dragging him toward the bakery. I'm never bringing you outside again. Kale chuckled, following him. Oh, little mage, this is the most fun I've had in centuries. The bakery smelled like heaven, or at least what Lure imagined heaven would smell like if it were made of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls. He stepped inside, and Kale followed close behind, looking thoroughly unimpressed by the shop. This is what mortals rave about. Bread? Lure rolled his eyes. Yes, bread. And pastries. You've lived for centuries, but you've clearly missed out on the finer things in life. Kale leaned against the counter, smirking. I doubt anything here will impress me. The baker, a cheerful man, spotted Lure and waved. Lure, good to see you. And you've brought company? His eyes lingered on Kale, who offered him a polite nod. Yeah, Lure said, glancing at Kale nervously. He's just visiting. The baker chuckled. Well, any friend of Lure's is welcome here. What'll it be today? Before Lure could answer, Kale straightened up, eyeing the pastries behind the glass. What's that? He asked, pointing to a croissant. Ah, a cream-filled croissant, the baker said proudly. Kale's smirk widened as the baker boxed up the croissant. A great choice. Anything else? I'll take the usual loaf of bread, Lure said. The baker nodded, packing their order. Here you go, the baker said. Enjoy. Lure handed over a few coins and grabbed the bag, practically dragging Kale out of the bakery. Once they were outside, Kale grabbed the bag from Lure and opened it. He pulled out the croissant and took a bite. His expression shifted almost instantly, eyes widening, lips parting slightly. Well? Lure asked, crossing his arms. Kale swallowed, looking genuinely stunned. This is amazing. Lure smirked, unable to resist a little smugness. Told you. Kale took another bite, savoring it. I might actually like this mortal world after all. Lure sighed. Great. Now you're going to get addicted to pastries. Kale smirked, licking a bit of cream from his thumb. Who knows? Maybe I'll get addicted to something or someone else. Lure groaned, walking faster. You're impossible. Kale chuckled, following him. As Lure placed the groceries on the kitchen counter, he noticed Kale lingering near the door. The Demon King's eyes flicked around the room, his posture oddly stiff. What's with you? Lure asked, unpacking the bread and herbs. Kale's lips curved into frown. Something feels off. Lure froze mid-reach for a carrot. Don't tell me there's an intruder. No, Kale murmured, his voice unusually low. It's something bigger, older. Before Lure could ask what he meant, the floor beneath their feet began to shake. What did you do? Lure shouted, backing away. Don't look at me, Kale said, his eyes narrowing. This is your house, little mage. Maybe you set a trap you forgot about. Lure groaned, running a hand through his hair. I didn't set a trap. What is this? His words were cut off as a figure materialized in the middle of the room. It was another demon, tall, with sharp features, dark wings folded neatly behind him, and a scowl on his face. His crimson eyes locked onto Kale immediately. There you are, the demon said, his tone dripping with irritation. I've been looking all over the realms for you. Kale's casual demeanor slipped, replaced with something colder. Zariel, what are you doing here? Fetching you, Zariel said sharply. You're the king. You can't just disappear on a whim. Lure, feeling entirely out of his depth, stepped between them. Excuse me, but this is my house, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't drag your inter-realm drama into it. Zariel's eyes flicked to Lure, and his expression twisted with disdain. This is where you've been hiding? With a human? Kale smirked, his confidence returning. I wasn't hiding. I was taking a vacation. Zariel's jaw clenched. You have responsibilities, Kale. The kingdom is in chaos without you. Good, Kale said breezily, crossing his arms. They could use the excitement. Zariel took a menacing step forward, but Kale raised a hand, a faint shimmer of power radiating from him. Careful, Zariel. You're in my mage's home now. Play nice. Lure's head whipped toward Kale. You're mage. Kale ignored him, his eyes locked with Zariel's. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut, and Lure felt a headache forming. Look, he said, stepping forward. I don't care what's happening in your demon kingdom, but Kale isn't leaving until he wants to. Right? Kale shot him a surprised look, then grinned. Right. Zariel sighed, frustrated. You're making a mistake, Kale. A dangerous one. I'll take my chances, Kale said smoothly. With a final glare, Zariel vanished in a cloud of black smoke, leaving the room eerily silent. Lure let out a shaky breath. What the hell was that? Kale shrugged, grabbing a croissant from the table. Just a little reminder of why I wanted to leave. Pass the jam. Lure stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. You can't just act like nothing happened. Kale smirked, leaning against the counter. Why not? He's gone, you're safe, and I still have my vacation. Everything's fine. Lure buried his face in his hands. I'm never going to have a normal day again, am I? Kale chuckled, his voice low and teasing. Not while I'm here, little mage. Lure sighed, pulling out a pot and slamming it onto the stovetop. Kale leaned against the counter, lazily munching on his croissant. What's on the menu tonight, chef? Stew, Lure replied curtly, chopping vegetables with a little more force than necessary. Kale watched him with an amused glint in his eyes. You're quite skilled with that knife. You'd make a decent assassin. Lure shot him a glare. I'm making dinner, not plotting murder. Kale shrugged, stealing a slice of carrot from the cutting board. Could be both. You never know. Lure swatted at his hand. Stop that. If you're going to hover, at least set the table. Kale raised an eyebrow. You're giving me chores now? Yes. Lure snapped, pointing the knife at him. You want to live like a mortal? Mortals help with dinner. Kale smirked, but complied, grabbing plates and utensils from the cabinet. By the time Lure finished cooking, the tension from Zariel's visit had mostly faded. They sat down to eat, Kale eyeing the bowl of stew like it might explode. Go on, Lure said, smirking. Try it, or are you scared of mortal food? Kale scooped up a spoonful and took a bite. His eyes widened slightly, and he gave an approving nod. Not bad, little mage. You got talent. Lure rolled his eyes. It's just stew. Don't downplay it, Kale said, leaning forward with a teasing grin. If you weren't a mage, you'd make an excellent housewife. Lure choked on his drink. Excuse me? Kale laughed, his deep voice filling the room. Relax. It's a compliment. That night, Lure was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a book. Kale lounged nearby, his long legs stretched out, looking impossibly comfortable for someone so out of place in the mortal world. Do you ever sleep? Lure asked, not looking up from his book. Not really, Kale replied, examining his nails. Demons don't need it like mortals do. Why? You offering to tuck me in? Lure groaned, slamming his book shut. I walked right into that one. Kale chuckled, his crimson eyes glinting in the dim light. You should know by now, little mage. I'll take any opportunity to fluster you. Lure huffed and stood, stretching. Well, I do need sleep, so try not to destroy the house while I'm unconscious. As Lure headed toward his bedroom, Kale called after him. Sweet dreams, Lure. Don't summon any more demons while I'm here. I'd hate to share the spotlight. Lure shook his head, muttering under his breath. This is my life now. Great. But as he closed the door to his room, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that maybe having Kale around wasn't the worst thing in the world. The next morning, Lure was in the kitchen again, making tea. Kale, lingering around as usual. Why don't you want to go back? Lure asked curiously. Kale pushed off the chair he was lounging on and walked closer, his tall figure casting a shadow over Lure. Do you actually want to know why I don't want to go back? Lure froze for a moment, seeing the look in his eyes. He turned to face Kale, his curiosity over the roof. Yeah, I mean, it's been bugging me. Why would the all-powerful Demon King abandon his throne? Kale's gaze dropped, his expression unreadable. It's not as glorious as you think. Ruling a kingdom means endless politics, constant power struggles, and people who want you dead just to take your place. Everyone smiles at you, but the moment you turn your back. He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Lure frowned, surprised by the vulnerability in Kale's voice. You were tired of it. Kale let out a bitter laugh. Tired? That's putting it lightly. I've ruled for centuries. You can only deal with so much betrayal before you start to question if it's even worth it. Lure opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Kale took a step forward, backing him into the counter. Do you know what it's like to never trust anyone? Kale's voice was low, almost a growl. To know that everyone around you would rather see you dead than happy. Lure swallowed hard, his heart racing as Kale's crimson eyes bore into his. And no, I don't. Kale leaned closer, his hands braced on either side of Lure, effectively pinning him to the counter. And then I get summoned by a clumsy little mage who doesn't even know what he's doing. And for the first time in centuries, I feel free. No court, no enemies, just you, bumbling around with your books and your rules. Lure's face turned bright red. I don't bumble. Kale's lips twitched into the faintest smirk. You do, but it's cute. Lure's mind scrambled for a coherent thought, but Kale's proximity made it impossible to focus. You keep trying to send me back, Kale murmured, his voice softer now. And I need you to understand, I don't want to go back. Not yet. The room was heavy with silence, until Lure finally found his voice, though it came out quieter than he intended. I didn't know it was that bad. Kale straightened slightly, but didn't move away. His eyes softened, and for a moment, Lure thought he saw a flicker of gratitude, maybe. I'll stay out of your way, Kale said, his tone lighter. But don't ask me to leave, Lure. Not yet. Lure nodded, still trapped between Kale and the counter. Fine, but can you maybe stop pinning me to things? Kale grinned, his mischievousness returning. No promises. With that, he finally stepped back, leaving Lure flustered and trying to calm his racing heart. The afternoon was calm, the kind of calm that made Lure suspicious. He sat at his desk, flipping through an old spell book, trying to research ways to tone down the Demon King's overwhelming aura. Kale, lounging on the couch, was humming a tune while playing with a lock of his dark hair. You know, I've been told I have an unforgettable presence. Why mess with perfection? Lure rolled his eyes. Your unforgettable presence is like a call to every magical creature within 100 miles. It's a problem, Kale. As if on cue, a low sound echoed through the room, making the hair on the back of Lure's neck stand up. Kale sat up instantly, his crimson eyes narrowing. Something's coming. Lure stood, heart pounding. What is it? Before Kale could answer, a deafening crash shattered the window, and a rogue magical creature burst into the room. Get back! Kale barked, stepping in front of Lure as the rogue lunged toward them. Lure stumbled back, his fingers fumbling for his staff. It's after you, isn't it? Kale smirked, his sharp teeth glinting. Probably. I'm irresistible like that. Stay behind me, Kale growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. The fight was fierce. The rogue magical creature was determined to obliterate Kale, but the Demon King stood his ground, every move precise and powerful. Lure watched in awe and terror. He'd never seen Kale fight before, and the sheer ferocity of it left him breathless. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, Kale unleashed a wave of dark fire, engulfing the rogue. It shrieked as its form disintegrating into harmless droplets of water that evaporated into the air. Kale staggered slightly, his hand clutching his bleeding side where the rogue had managed to cut. "You're hurt." Lure ran to him. "It's nothing," Kale muttered, brushing off the concern. "It's not nothing," Lure snapped, pulling him gently to sit on the couch. "Stay still." Kale raised an eyebrow, but allowed Lure to fuss over him. The mage muttered under his breath, gathering supplies from his cabinet. As Lure cleaned the wound with trembling hands, Kale watched him quietly. The usual teasing glint in his eyes was gone, replaced by something softer. "You didn't have to jump in like that," Lure murmured, dabbing at the wound with a damp cloth. Kale's voice was low. "Of course I did. I'm not letting anything happen to you." Lure's hands froze for a moment, his cheeks flushing. "Why would you care?" Kale reached up, gently taking Lure's wrist to stop him. "Do you really not know by now?" The words hung in the air. Lure's heart pounded as Kale leaned closer, his crimson eyes searching his. Lure's breath hitched. They were so close now, their faces mere inches apart. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Their lips hovered dangerously close, and Lure felt himself leaning in, almost instinctively. A loud thud from outside shattered the moment. Lure jerked back, his face burning. Kale chuckled softly. "Saved by the noise, huh?" Lure stood abruptly, avoiding Kale's gaze. "I need to get someone to fix the window," he said, gesturing to the shattered window, where the creature had came in from. Kale leaned back, a smirk on his lips. "Don't take too long, little mage. I'll be waiting." Lure rushed outside, his heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the rogue magical creature attack. Later that evening, the house had fallen into an unusual stillness. Kale sat by the window, gazing out at the quiet village. His crimson eyes, often filled with mischief, now looked distant. Lure, still shaken from the rogue creature attack, approached cautiously. "Hey, you've been quiet since earlier. Are you okay?" Kale didn't answer immediately, but when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "You know, today made something very clear to me." Lure frowned, taking a seat across from him. "What's that?" Kale turned to face him, a sad look on his face. "I don't belong here." The words hit Lure harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" "Of course you do." "Well, sort of. I mean, you're here now, and we've figured it out so far, haven't we?" "Lure, I'm not just some random visitor crashing at your place. I'm the Demon King. My presence alone is like a giant flashing sign for trouble. That creature? It won't be the last thing drawn to me. And next time," his expression darkened. "Next time, I might not be able to stop it in time." Lure's chest tightened. He hated that Kale was right, but the thought of him leaving made something ache deep inside. "So what? You think leaving is the solution? You think I'll be safer without you?" "Yes," Kale said firmly. "You will be." Lynn shot to his feet, frustrated. "And what about you? Will you be fine going back to your kingdom?" "You were miserable there, Kale." Kale's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Lure stepped closer, his voice trembling. "You can't just decide what's best for me. You don't get to do that. If you're in danger, we'll figure it out together. I'm a mage, remember? I'm not helpless." Kale looked up at him, his eyes softening. "You don't understand what you're saying, Lure. I've lived through centuries of loss. I can't. I won't risk you becoming just another name in my memory." Lure's breath caught, his heart pounding, and before he could stop himself, Lure reached out, grabbing Kale's arm. "I'm not just some fragile human you have to protect. I'm your friend. And friends don't run away just because things get hard." Kale stared at him, clearly caught off guard. "You really want me to stay?" Kale finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lure hesitated, his cheeks burning. I do." He looked Kale in the eyes. "I really do." Kale's expression softened. "You're a stubborn little mage, you know that?" "Yeah, well, someone has to be when you're being an idiot," Lure shot back, his voice filled with affection. Kale laughed quietly, but there was a warmth in his tone that hadn't been there before. "All right, I'll stay. For now." Lure exhaled in relief. The next morning, Lure groggily rubbed his eyes, still half asleep as he walked into the kitchen. Kale was already there, leaning casually against the counter with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His eyes watched Lure's movements, gleaming with amusement. "Morning, little mage," Kale greeted, his voice teasing. Lure grumbled an inaudible greeting back, busying himself with finding a mug. Kale smirked. "You seemed pretty passionate last night, you know, practically begging me to stay." Lure froze, the mug slipping slightly in his grip. I wasn't begging. Don't twist my words. Oh, but you were so convincing, Kale continued, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. He leaned in closer, his voice low. It was so cute, Lure. Lure's face burned. Don't make it weird. Kale stepped closer, invading Lure's space with that infuriating smirk. Weird? You mean like how your face turns bright red every time I get near you? Lure's breath hitched as Kale casually reached past him to grab the sugar jar, his arm brushing against Lure's. I don't know what you're talking about, Lure stammered, turning away to pour his coffee. Kale chuckled, low and dangerous. Oh, I think you do. Before Lure could escape, Kale caught his wrist, spinning him back around, almost losing balance over the mug in his hand as he found himself pressed against the counter, Kale's tall frame towering over him. Admit it, Lure, Kale murmured, his face so close their noses almost touched. You like having me around, maybe even more than you want to admit. Lure's heart raced, pounding in his ears. Why, you were just imagining things. Kale tilted his head, his voice turning soft, almost a whisper. Am I? Because you don't look like someone who wants me to stop. Lure swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. For a moment, neither of them moved, tension in the air. Then, with deliberate slowness, Kale leaned closer, his lips brushing the shell of Lure's ear. You should be careful, little mage, he murmured, his breath warm against Lure's skin. One day, you might realize you need me just as much as I need you. Before Lure could respond, Kale pulled back with a grin, grabbing his coffee and walking off as if nothing had happened. Lure stood there, his heart racing and his cheeks hot. I hate him, he muttered under his breath, though the fluttering in his heart told a very different story. That afternoon, they had an unexpected guest. Kale was seated on the edge of the couch, tension radiating from him as Zariel, his second-in-command, knelt before him. Another demon stood nearby, their presence amplifying the gravity of the situation. Your Majesty, Zariel began, his tone sharp yet respectful. The western provinces are in chaos. It has grown into a full-scale war. They've started targeting the capital. If you don't return, we risk losing control entirely. Kale pinched the bridge of his nose, the weight of his kingdom pressing down on him. It always spirals out of control when I'm not there, he muttered. How bad is it? The worst it's been in centuries, Zariel said grimly. They've aligned with rogue magical creature, elementals, and other factions. The council is losing faith in our ability to hold them back without you. Lure, who had been quietly listening from the corner of the room, felt his stomach knot. He hated the idea of Kale leaving, especially for something as dangerous as a war. Kale sighed, standing. Fine. Prepare the portal. I'll deal with this myself. Lure quickly stepped forward. Wait, you're going to go? Kale turned to him, his expression unreadable. Yes, this is my responsibility, Lure. I need to protect my kingdom. Then take me with you. Lure blurted out, his voice firmer than he expected. Kale stared at him, his eyes narrowing. Absolutely not. I can help, Lure insisted. I'm a mage. I can fight. No, Lure, Kale said sharply. This isn't a negotiation. It's too dangerous. You'd be a liability out there. Lure's cheeks flushed with anger. I'm not some helpless human. I can handle myself. Kale stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Lure. His voice softened, but his tone was firm. Lure, if something happened to you. He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Stay here. That's an order. With that, Kale turned to Zariel. We leave immediately. Lure paced the house after Kale left, frustration bubbling inside him. He couldn't just sit here while Kale walked into danger, even though he knew he was the Demon King and could very well take care of himself. Zariel had been the last one to step through the portal, and Lure remembered the demon's look he gave him before disappearing. He just realized that it was a message, an opportunity. Grabbing his staff, Lure bolted outside, finding Zariel waiting for him outside the portal. You're coming, aren't you? Zariel asked, smirking. Lure squared his shoulders. I'm not staying behind. Zariel chuckled. You got guts, mage. Let's go. Lure's heart pounded as he and Zariel stepped through the portal. He gasped as he saw the severity of the war. The battlefield was filled with smoke, fire, demons, rogue elementals, and other monstrous creatures tearing into one another, the air thick with magic and bloodlust. Zariel guided Lure to a hidden spot on the outskirts, but it didn't take long for Kale to notice Lure's presence. What the hell are you doing here? Kale growled, striding through the chaos to confront Lure. Lure opened his mouth to speak, but Kale grabbed his wrist, dragging him away from the battlefront. Zariel wisely disappeared, leaving the two of them alone. You disobeyed me, Kale growled, his voice low and dangerous. Lure yanked his arm free, glaring up at him. You don't get to decide what I do. I couldn't just sit at home while you fought a war. Kale leaned down, his face inches from Lure's. You've put yourself in danger, and you've distracted me. Do you have any idea how reckless this is? I'm not a child. Lure shot back. I can take care of myself. Kale's jaw clenched, his frustration evident. You'll be punished for this later, he said darkly, his voice laced with a promise that made Lure's heart skip a beat. Before Lure could respond, a massive explosion shook the ground, snapping both their attention back to the battlefield. Kale's expression hardened. This isn't over, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Stay close to Zerial. Lure nodded, gripping his staff tightly as Kale turned and unleashed his full power, charging into the chaos. For the first time, Lure truly saw him as the Demon King. And despite the danger, Lure felt a strange sense of pride. Kale was fighting for his people, but Lure realized he was fighting for something more than that now. After a long time, the enemies surrendered after losing too much of their own, and the war was over. The battlefield had fallen silent. Lure stood at the edge of the field, exhausted but alive, leaning heavily on his staff. He had thrown every ounce of his magic into helping. He made barriers to protect Kale's soldiers, strikes to scatter enemies, and a last-minute surge of energy that had saved Kale himself from a devastating blow. Kale approached him now, his hair a mess, and his crimson eyes still burning with intensity. Lure felt his stomach flip under that gaze. You, Kale said, his voice low and controlled. You disobeyed me. You risked your life. Lure swallowed hard. Kale didn't let him finish. You could have been killed, Lure. Do you even understand that? He stepped closer, his tall frame looming. Instead of staying safe like I ordered, you threw yourself into the middle of a war. Lure felt his own temper flare. And what would have happened if I hadn't? I saved your soldiers. I saved you, Kale. I'm not sorry for that. Kale's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. That doesn't excuse. Lure couldn't take it anymore. Before he could think twice, he surged forward and grabbed Kale by the collar, yanking him down. Their lips crashed together, and for a split second, Kale froze. But then he responded. Kale's hands came to Lure's waist, pulling him closer as he deepened the kiss. His lips were hot and demanding, leaving Lure breathless. The anger leaving Kale immediately. When they finally broke apart, Lure's chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. Kale's smirk was back, sharper than ever, his crimson eyes practically glowing. Well, Kale murmured, his voice low and husky. That was bold of you. Lure felt his cheeks burn, but he held his ground. I thought it might help calm you down. Kale chuckled, the sound dark and rich. Calm me down? Oh no, little mage. You've done the opposite. He leaned in, his breath brushing against Lure's ear. You've earned your punishment, and trust me, I don't forget. Lure shivered at the promise in Kale's voice, his heart pounding as Kale pulled back just enough to lock their gazes. But, Kale added, his tone softening ever so slightly, you did well out there. Better than I expected. Lure blinked, surprised by the rare compliment. Thank you. Kale's smirk softened into a faint smile, though his eyes still held that teasing glint. Don't think that gets you out of trouble. Before Lure could respond, Kale turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, flustered and dazed, with a racing heart and a lot to think about. Kale and Lure had gone back to the mortal world that night. The next morning, Kale stood near the kitchen, watching Lure as the mage made some tea. Lure glanced over his shoulder. You're staring. It's weird. Kale smirked, leaning casually against the wall. I'm allowed to stare. You're mine to stare at. Lure rolled his eyes, but couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at his lips. Bold of you to assume I belong to you. Kale smirked. Maybe bold, but not wrong. Lure paused. He turned to face Kale, crossing his arms. What's that supposed to mean? Kale straightened, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something more serious. He stepped closer, his towering frame making Lure tilt his head to meet his gaze. It's not exactly common, Kale began, his voice quieter than usual, for a demon king to feel this way about anyone, let alone a human. Lure blinked, his heart skipping a beat. Feel? What way? Kale's lips twitched into a small smile. Don't make me spell it out, mage. I think you already know. Lure's cheeks flushed, but he held Kale's gaze. Maybe I want to hear it anyway. Kale chuckled softly, shaking his head. Fine. I feel a lot for you, Lure. More than I ever thought I could feel for someone. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Lure's face. You drive me insane. You disobey me. And you challenge me in ways no one else ever has. And yet, I don't think I've ever been happier than I am here with you. Lure's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. Kale stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. So, will you go out with me? Whatever that means in your world. Lutter stared at him, stunned for a moment, before a soft laugh escaped him. You're asking me on a date? Kale shrugged, a small grin tugging at his lips. If that's what humans call it, then yes. Lutter smiled, warmth spreading through his chest. I'd be an idiot to say no, wouldn't I? Kale nodded his head. You would. Then I guess I'm saying yes, Lutter said, his voice soft but steady. Kale's grin widened, the sight making Lur's stomach flip. Good. I'll make it worth your while. Lur laughed, shaking his head. You're impossible. And you love it. Kale teased, his crimson eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Lur didn't argue. Maybe he did. That night was quiet, the air in Lur's home thick with unspoken emotions after Kale's earlier confession. They'd shared a simple dinner, but the way Kale's gaze lingered on Lur told him something was coming. You still owe me your punishment, Kale said, his voice low and deliberate as he leaned back in his chair, crimson eyes fixed on Lur like a predator, sizing up its prey. Lur swallowed hard, his cheeks heating. You're still on about that? Kale smirked, standing and slowly closing the distance between them. Oh, I never forget. Come here. Lur hesitated, but the commanding tone in Kale's voice made his stomach flip. He stood, feeling Kale's intense gaze follow every step he took. Turn around, Kale murmured, his voice a mix of teasing and authority. What are you, Lur? Kale interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Don't make me repeat myself. Lur's heart pounded as he turned, his back now facing Kale. He felt the Demon King's strong hands on his waist, pulling him closer, and the next thing he knew, a sharp smack landed on his butt. Kale, did you just spank me? Lur yelped, spinning around to glare at him. Kale grinned, his expression maddeningly smug. That's for sneaking into a war zone. Lur's face burned. You're insane. Maybe, Kale said, his grin softening into something warmer as he leaned in, brushing his lips against Lur's. That night, they had sex, and Lur learned firsthand just how much Kale had been holding back as they kept switching dimensions during it. By the time the night was over, Lur was exhausted. The next morning, Zariel arrived, his ever-watchful eyes immediately catching the way Lur limped around the room. Limping, are we? Zariel drawled, a knowing smirk tugging at his lips. Lunar's face turned beet red. Don't start. Zariel chuckled. I don't need to start. The evidence speaks for itself. Kale entered then, looking far too pleased with himself. Zariel, don't tease him too much. He's been through enough. Oh, I can see that, Zariel said with a wink. Lur groaned, burying his face in his hands. I hate both of you. Kale chuckled, wrapping an arm around Lur's waist and pulling him close. You love me. Lur mumbled something incoherent, but the blush on his face said enough. Over time, word spread through the Demon Kingdom about the human who had captured their king's heart. Lur was introduced as Kale's bride during a grand announcement in the royal palace. To his surprise, the kingdom's reaction was overwhelmingly accepting. The demons cheered for their king's happiness, and though some whispered about the oddness of a human as the bride of a demon king, most seemed to genuinely adore Lur's presence. Standing beside Kale during the ceremony, Lur felt a strange sense of belonging. Kale leaned down, whispering in his ear, They love you already. Told you this would work. Lur smiled, feeling warmth bloom in his chest as he looked up at Kale. Maybe they just love you. Kale smirked. Well, I do make a good king. But tonight, I'm only yours. Lur blushed, his heart skipping a beat as he realized he wouldn't trade this life for anything. Not even for the normal, quiet existence he'd once dreamed of. The end.